Joining me now from the Sydney CBD is Shadow Infrastructure and Transport Minister, Bridget McKenzie. Good to talk to you again, Bridget. First up, do you reckon it's okay for the Prime Minister to be on leave already? He hasn't even been in the job for 100 days.
Look, Chris, if the Prime Minister feels he needs a holiday prior to his 100-day mark, that's a matter for him. I know that often when you're on holidays, you have a bit of a break and you get some really good ideas happening. Maybe he can get a plan for how he's actually going to get those electricity prices down by the $275 he promised Australians, and can actually think about how we actually get the details around the voice that they've sort of announced. But obviously Australians are still waiting for more details. So hopefully he uses his holidays wisely. Yeah,
has some thinking time at the beach, perhaps. Now, I'll come back to those issues you mentioned in a moment, but also with your former Nationals colleague, John Barilaro, appearing before the parliamentary inquiry in New South Wales today. What astounds me about this is that neither John Barilaro, the Premier Dominic Perrottet, the Treasurer Matt Keane, the Trade Minister Stuart Ayres, former Trade Minister, or even the former Premier Barry O'Farrell, who apparently was John Barilaro's referee in this process, none of them seemed to see that this was going to be a political problem. Surely it was always going to look like jobs for the boys, sending John Barilaro to New York.
Well, Chris, I think no matter whether it's a former parliamentarian or not, these sort of roles need to go through a proper process. And, you know, we've got some fantastic ex-MPs who've been wonderful ambassadors for us in Arthur Sinodinos, obviously George Brandis. We've got Peter McGorran was a trade councillor in Texas for a while. So being an MP or a former MP shouldn't preclude you from these sorts of roles, but obviously should go through the proper process. We're a trading nation. We need to have people that are passionate about that status and who can actually facilitate connections internationally, whether they're at a state or a federal level going forward. So these are really important roles for our future, and particularly for those of us in the regions.
Now, on to the climate wars that supposedly are over, but apparently the climate wars are over if everyone just agrees to do what the Greens and the Tills and Labor want. So that's what they mean by the wars being over. But the Coalition's announced it's going to take a higher target for 2030 to the next election. But the current target of 28% is likely to be exceeded by the time of the next election, and you're on track to be over 30% anyway by 2030. The key question is whether or not the Coalition is going to prioritise our economy over meeting these arbitrary targets that aren't going to change the climate because global emissions continue to rise.
Yeah, and Chris, I think your article on the weekend really made that salient point and really brought to light the fact that you can love our natural environment, be passionate about ensuring we're good stewards on this earth as a human species, and still, not necessarily see that legislating this target will achieve the outcome that everybody wants. What we've announced is that we'll be reviewing our climate change policies as we head to the next election. The reality is the Albanese government obviously changed our nationally determined contribution to 43%. They did that. They also removed, might I say, a productivity commission review every 5 years into what the impact of those climate policies were going to be. But in legislating, they've actually, I think, set up quite a cataclysmic clash between the wellbeing, our economic wellbeing as a nation and as individuals and families, and our environmental ambition. I mean, even in my own portfolio area, Infrastructure Australia, for instance, is going to be one of those agencies that's going to have to consider the target in the projects that they recommend, and so they'll be more likely then to prioritise public transport spending in capital cities than the regional roads, rail and bridges programs that really drive our productivity as a nation. And similarly, we've seen what's happened overseas in the UK, for instance, when they legislated their target. Instead of giving certainty to investment, it actually resulted in infrastructure projects getting into law courts, Heathrow's third runway, for an instance, blowing out timelines and adding considerable cost and the risk of even these projects cancelling. Now, if we look at our economic trajectory, we're going to need the productivity gains and the emissions gains, might I say, about infrastructure projects in the pipeline, rather than throwing them into greater uncertainty. So I think legislating the target was a bad idea, and we did the right thing in not supporting it.